in the last 8 months or since quantitative easing took effect. The headline inflation shot up, the core stayed low, so we've seen a dramatic increase in headline. But what has been the result of economic activity, particularly for consumer income and consumer spending? Deteriorated. So the net result of that policy would be to literally clobber our middle income households, because the upper income households would be able to protect themselves. They and their investment advisors would respond immediately to such a policy of direct printing of the money. And in the night, if you go back, let's do a little history of economics. Go back to the election of 1960, which I think was a very critical election.
6-0 or 60?
6-0.
John Kennedy.
John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. Both candidates advocated greater government involvement in economic activity. The only issue was how much more government should be involved. Shortly thereafter, the notion was promulgated by James Tobin of Yale and others that we could improve the social outcome by manipulating the Phillips curve. We could adopt increased government spending, increased money supply, and we could lower the unemployment rate, and it wouldn't raise the inflation rate that much. Well, we needed an objective standard in order to determine whether this policy was working or not. Well, a Yale colleague of Tobin came up with something called the misery index. And the net result was, of the greater government intervention, the misery index was at around 5% in the 1950s. By the early 1980s, it was approaching 20%. In other words, the policy did not produce a better return, and it caused this income and wealth divide.
In other words, trying to reduce the unemployment rate, raise misery.
and look at the misery index under QE2.
Right.
In the period of time leading up to QE2, the misery index was around 9, and now it's running 14. I mean, we've clearly made things worse off, and the greatest damage were those least able to protect themselves. And that's the result of inflation. So I would hope that we wouldn't go down the inflationary route. This is an option, but it's an option that will skew the results very badly for many people.
Okay, I have one last question. Interest rates. You're a noted expert on Treasury rates, and I believe the number, I believe the 10-year is exactly at 3%, I believe.
Slightly higher, yeah.
Slightly higher. Which I believe at one point years ago you told me that I believe that was the long-term average of maybe 50 or 100 years or so.
I'd rather deal with the 30-year because that's how I look at it.
All right. Well,
the 30-year right now.
Let me throw the question out, and then you can comment on it. But so we're at reasonably low rates historically, or pretty close to what the long average is before the manipulation attempts were made. But we're also facing an incredible combination of things. Number one is it is the end of QE2. Number two, we do have large deficits. Number three, we have the Greece contagion, which could work two ways. One is it could affect the perception of risk of our treasuries. It also affects capital inflows from Europe. A lot of things on the table at once. Then we also have some inflation in the air, and I guess I mentioned sovereign risk. So, and we are pretty close, I think, to the long-term average. So how do you think all these mega factors will end up net affecting the treasuries?
I really like the thrust of your question, because what you're making, your question makes it clear that when you look at interest rates, it is a complex issue. There's no silver bullets. There are many factors at work in the economic outlook at all times. The key element of all of them, or the most important, would be the inflation rate. Now, just to give you a couple of statistics, since 1870, and we have excellent data, the long treasury, not the 10-year, the longest prevailing treasury has averaged about 4.3.
What would be the duration of the longest Treasury? We now have 30s. There were periods of time.
There were some cases when it was 25 years, some years 20.
Okay.
Actually, at one point in time, we had some federal debt issues of 30 years. Those were the Panama Canal bonds, and it said on them, issued by the Treasury carrying the full faith and credit. So I mean, it's not a constant maturity, so there's a little bit of a problem there.
But there are 20 to 30.
20 to 30 years. Yep. So, and we're within 10 basis points of that right now. We're at the long-term average. Over that entire time period, the inflation rate, the headline rate, was about 2%. So you had a net return after inflation of 2.25%. That's the numbers. Now, my feeling, and our feeling at Hoisington Management, is that over the next year, the inflation rate is going to trend lower. We think that the end of quantitative easing means that M2 growth, which has recently accelerated to about 5%, will shift back toward 2. Nominal GDP will come off slightly, and the inflation rate will recede. We think that the contagion is an issue. We're very alert to it. Our skills for analyzing it, very tough. I mean, so many points here. We're doing the best we can, but our feeling is that for the time being, the problems are more serious outside the United States than they are in. So we see some further drop in the long rate. Last year, for example, or if we go back to the end of '09, the long Treasury was around 460, and it closed the year around 435. For a long duration Treasury portfolio, it returned about 10% last year. I think that at the end of this year, we're going to be around 4, which means that if you're willing to deal with the volatility, and there's going to be been a lot of volatility constantly, month in, month out, that will give a long duration Treasury portfolio about a 10% return this year. So for the time being, for investors who have a longer term view, prepared for the volatility, we think that this is a excellent investment. Beyond the next year, very difficult to see. It's a matter of looking at the incoming data constantly and trying to make the best assessment that you can at any one point in time.
Okay, last question, which relates to the sovereign risk issue. How do you think it's going to play out between now and August 2nd in terms of our own debt ceiling and issues of whether or not we can meet our payrolls?
Well, here's where I can look really stupid. This is what I think will happen. I believe the House of Representatives will send a bill to the Senate with a number of reductions along the lines of the Ryan proposals. Send it to the Senate. It will be decried by the Senate as a non-starter, be decried as the White House as a non-starter. But the House will have shifted the onus from themselves to the Senate. The Senate will then defeat the House bill, and they will go into negotiations at the last minute, and that they will hammer out a compromise. And I don't know how meaningful the compromise will be, but I think that they will eventually get a compromise. It may be that it's a very short-term compromise, one that raises the debt ceiling for a matter of months or half a year and kicks the can down the road. In other words, they achieve a few modest things now, make a few adjustments to Medicare, some adjustments to the defense budget, and perhaps some revenue enhancements, not raising the overall marginal tax rates, but perhaps eliminating some of the so-called expenditures in the tax code. But this process is going to be with us and on the front burner for a long time to come.
in addition to all the other risks I threw out, we got to add political risk.
We do have. We have political risk.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
We're not getting any younger, Lee. Great to be with you again.
Likewise.
Excellent questions.
Thank you.